everybody, it's jrobichess. Today we're going to be taking a look at the King's Indian attack strategy from white. And it's an opening that's a little bit near and dear to my heart because shortly after I started playing chess, this was one of the first openings that I spent a lot of time on, getting comfortable with it, learning how the play follows after different moves and things of that nature. Now I parted pass with the King's Indian attack, but not because it wasn't a very effective opening. I wanted to start biting into the Ruy Lopez, so I focused on that mainly in response to black playing e5. But this opening by itself has been used by some very notable players, including Bobby Fischer. The opening statistics on the opening itself are very impressive. Since the early 1900s, white's won about 43% of the time. Black wins about 29% of the time, and about 28% of the games are drawn. Now, these statistics are from just straight human players. There's no computer games included in those statistics whatsoever. So you can tell by the numbers that it's a very dynamic opening, obviously. And, it has lost a little bit of popularity over the past couple decades, but that's not because it's not a good opening. I'm not too sure exactly why it's lost popularity. But it's an interesting opening, but the most important thing about it is that you don't have to be booked up to the gills to use it. And you might be wondering why I don't have the black pieces on the board here right now, and it's simply because you can achieve this position through a variety of move orders. And this is kind of the target position that you're going to shoot for in the King's Indian attack. So in this video we'll take a look at some common ways you can achieve this position, and we'll take a look at a bunch of different alternatives. For example, let's say we want to open up with pawn to e4 to get into this structure. We'll take a look at black's most common replies to that. Of course, we have the Sicilian defense, which is pawn to c5. We'll take a look at the French, and we'll also take a look at the Caro-Kann defense. But we're also going to take a look at some alternate first move options. You don't have to play pawn to e4 to get into the King's Indian attack. You can play something like g3, knight to f3, pawn to d3. So we'll be taking a look at all of those, and hopefully by the end of the video we'll have a fairly comprehensive understanding of how we can achieve this position almost irregardless of what black plays out of the opening. But before we get into those examples, I want to talk a little bit about this position that you see here on your screen. So if you want to pause the video, take a couple minutes to think to yourself how you would coordinate your pieces coming out of this position against black. Definitely go ahead and do so. I'm going to talk about some common strategies of the opening. The first, of course, is eventually we're going to try to push our pawn to e5, and we're going to try to bind up the center a little bit to help coordinate an attack on black's castle position if black is castled on the king's side. Now, even if we don't push the pawn to e5, let's just take a look at some of the other pieces that white has at its disposal. The first one that really jumps out at me, of course, is the rook here on f1. Now, the rook on f1 can slide over here to e1 and contribute to e-file pressure. If the king ever moves to g2, the rook can swing over to the h-file and give h-file pressure. So that rook is very dynamic in the position. Another piece that I really like in this setup, of course, is the bishop here on c1. Now, the c1 bishop, if the pawn ever pushes up to b3, can snug up here on b2 and contribute to a castle attack along this dark square diagonal. But even if it just stays on c1, it's already pointing at h6. So it's a very useful piece coming out of the opening position. Of course, we also have the knight here on f3, and the knight on f3 is a very dynamic piece as well. It's sitting on f3, but it has a lot of basically a lot of options available to it. It can swing over here to e5 or support the pawn on e5 if we ever push it there. Of course, it can also jump to g5 and h4. So the knight is definitely a nice piece in that position. And of course, we can't forget the queen. The queen is here on d1, and depending on how play follows and how the play shapes up, she's going to have a lot of options at her disposal. Namely, of course, right out of the onset, she has access along this light square diagonal to, say, for example, g4 or h5. And of course, we can't forget our nice little bishop here on g2. Now, the bishop on g2, of course, if the pawn ever does get pushed up to e5, can of course access this long light square diagonal here all the way to a8. But of course, the bishop can also be rerouted to h3, or f1 up to e2, and so definitely a very flexible piece in the fianchetto position there for the bishop. So either way you look at it, like, I mean, the position is a very dynamic position for white, and it's going to be a very good fighting game coming out of this opening position. So we're going to take a look at some examples now. I'm going to put the pieces back in a starting position, and we'll take a look at the common replies that black will play to an e4 opening to get into the structure, and then we'll take a look at some of the alternative first moves that white has to get into the structure as well. Now, the first few lines that we're going to take a look at in the King's Indian attack is if you want to get into that strategy by playing pawn to e4. Now, from pawn to e4, black obviously has a number of great defenses that it can employ. We're going to take a look at the strongest one that it's currently using, which is a Sicilian defense, pushing the pawn up to c5. Now, when you see pawn to c5, obviously the Sicilian defense, it's a very strong defense, but it's not strong enough to prevent you from getting into a King's Indian attack-like structure. And we're going to take a look at the most played moves in these positions that follow. So from pawn to c5, now white's simply going to develop the knight to f3. Now, the most played move by the grandmasters in this position is to push the pawn up now to e6, getting ready to thrust the d pawn forward up to d5. White's going to continue, however, by pushing the pawn up now to d3. And we can see that the King's Indian attack structure is starting to take shape. First of all, we have this dark square bishop here on c1 that now is liberated and has access pointing towards h6. And of course, we need to remember that we can just push our b pawn up now to b3 and fianchetto that bishop if we want to, giving it scope along this dark square diagonal, which is going to be pointing directly at black's castle position if it castles on the king's side. So the position is definitely starting to take shape, and there's not much that black can do to stop white from achieving this. So from here, the most played move now is to thrust that d pawn forward, from which white is simply going to play knight up now to d2. Black's most played move in this position is to develop the knight now to c6, and white is simply going to push the pawn up now to g3, getting ready to fianchetto that light square bishop. From here, black will play knight up to f6, and white can fianchetto that light square bishop. Black will develop its bishop now to e7, white can castle, and black can castle. And here we are in the King's Indian attack structure. So as you can see, even the Sicilian defense can't really stop white from achieving this position. Now, what you see on the screen here right now is a very equal position, but it's going to be a good fighting game. A couple things that stand out, of course. Black generally is going to get a little bit more room on the queen side. White, on the other hand, however, is going to have some really nice attacking potential on black's castle position, especially when we factor in all the piece coordination that white can bring to the table to contribute to a kingside castle attack. But nonetheless, it's a very workable position for both sides, and it's going to be a nice fighting game from this point. So let's flip back now to e4 and take a look at some other common defensive strategies that black could use against the e4 opening that will still let white get into the King's Indian attack structure. So we're going to take a look here at the French defense, pawn to e6. From here, white's simply going to play pawn up to d3, and the most played move in this position is for black to push that pawn up forward now to d5, at which point white is simply going to develop the knight now to d2, giving the pawn another defender here on e4 and developing a piece at the same time. From here, black can play knight up to f6, and white's simply going to develop another piece by placing the knight now onto f3. So we can see the characteristics starting to take shape here for the King's Indian attack. From here, black can push the pawn up to c5, staking a claim to, once again, a little bit more of a queenside space advantage, at which point white's simply going to push the pawn up now to g3, getting ready to fianchetto that bishop. Black can play knight to c6, and white can fianchetto the bishop. Black can develop their bishop, and white can castle. And from here, black has a lot of moves that it can play. It can castle as well. It can play pawn to b6, queen to c7, all of which have been played before. But in this position here, white's in a very good position again. The King's Indian attack position has been reached, and it's going to be a fighting game from this point forward. So let's go back to e4, and let's take a look at what happens if black decides to play the Caro-Kann defense, which is pawn to c6. We're going to see a similar strategy here. White's simply going to play pawn up now to d3. Black can thrust that d pawn forward to d5, and white can simply develop the knight again to d2. From here, black can push the pawn up now to e5. White can simply develop the knight now to f3, at which point black can bring the bishop up now to d6. So a little bit different. The bishop isn't tucked here on e7. But from here, white simply can push the pawn up now to g3, once again getting ready to fianchetto that bishop. Black can play knight to f6. White can fianchetto the bishop. bishop, black can castle, and white can castle. And once again, we're in a very similar position. And, fairly equal, but definitely a good fighting position for both sides. But the nice thing about the King's Indian attack is that you're working from a very similar position in a variety of defenses that black can employ. One of the things that I really liked about it when I started playing the King's Indian attack is that since I didn't have to be booked up to the gills, I just had to be comfortable in this position and aware of the threats and the risks associated with playing it. But nonetheless, it's a very solid opening strategy that white can use. So I'm going to go back right to the very beginning here. We're going to take a look at some alternative first move options for white. And once again, we'll see that it's very consistent in that white can get into the same type of structure pretty much regardless of what black plays. So the first one we're going to take a look at, which is another move that's near and dear to my heart, is knight to f3. Now, of course, this is the ready opening, but we can also transpose into a lot of different openings from knight to f3. From here now, black's usually going to play pawn up to d5, and from here now, white can simply play pawn up to g3, getting ready to fianchetto that light square bishop. From here, the most played move is knight to f6, and white can now fianchetto that light square bishop. Black can push the pawn up to c5, so once again, trying to gain a little bit more space on the queen side. White can castle, and then from here, black can develop another piece with knight to c6. Play can continue. White pushes the pawn up now to d3. Black can push the pawn up now to e6, and white can develop the knight now to d2. So as we can see, we're definitely getting into that King's Indian setup. From here, the most played moves continues now. Black develops a bishop to e7, and white simply thrusts that pawn forward to e4. Black castles, and white swings rook over now to e1. From here, black can play pawn to b5, once again trying to secure more queenside space. But I want to flip back a move here to e4. Sometimes you'll see the opponents play pawn takes here on e4, and this actually works out a little bit more advantageous for white. White can capture the back with the pawn. When black castles, white can simply push the pawn up now to e5, and white's going to have a very good game from this position. So there's always alternative moves in every position. It's just a matter of taking advantage of what happens when they're played. So that's what can happen when we play knight to f3 as our first move. Let's take a look at d3. Now, d3 has some similarities as well. So from here, we're going to play pawn to d5 as black, the most played move in the position, and white's simply going to push the pawn up to g3, once again getting ready to fianchetto that bishop, and play's going to continue knight to f6 by black, and now white's going to fianchetto the bishop on g2. Black can push the pawn up now to c6, and white can play knight to f3. So as you can see, we're definitely getting back into the normal state of affairs here for the King's Indian attack. From this position, black can swing that bishop down now a little bit more aggressively than we've seen in other lines here to g4. White's simply going to castle in this position. Black can swing the knight over to d7, and now white's going to bring the knight now to d2, giving the knight here on f3 another defender, and getting ever so closer to that King's Indian attack structure. From here, black can push the pawn up now to e5, and white can push the pawn up now to e4. So once again, we see that pawn thrusting forward. Black can capture, white can retake with the pawn, and then from here, black swings the bishop down now to c5. So while there are some subtle differences compared to the other lines that we've taken a look at, obviously we've had some captures here on e4. From white's perspective, we're very much in the King's Indian attack structure. Of course, in this line, black has much more aggressively placed bishops. Of course, we got the bishop here on g4 and the bishop on c5, bearing down into the white position. But this is easily solved here from white by just playing pawn to h3, putting the question to this light square bishop here on g4. The best move in this position for black is just to retreat that bishop instead of trade it, at which point white can now develop the queen now to e2. Black can castle, and white can now swing that knight over to b3, attacking the dark square bishop. And from this position, it's going to be a fairly good game for both sides, maybe even a slight positional advantage from white in this position. But nonetheless, the King's Indian attack structure was very easy to create after playing pawn to d3. Now I just want to conclude things up here by looking at g3 as our first move. And very similar to the other lines that we've taken a look at. Black's going to push to d5, white can fianchetto, black can swing the knight up now to f6, and white can play knight up now to f3, at which point black can play now pawn to c6, white can castle, and black can bring that bishop down aggressively again to g4. White can play d3, black can bring the knight up now to d7, and white can develop its knight now to d2. So once again, very similar to the other lines that we were taking a look at. From here now, black can push the pawn up now to e5, white pushes the pawn up to e4, black captures, white retakes with the pawn, and black swings a bishop down now to c5. So very similar to the other line that we took a look at. And once again, white can continue on with moves like h3, queen to e1, or queen to e2, for example. So there's no doubt that it's fairly straightforward to get into the position. I'm just going to flip back to this position here that arose after the Sicilian defense of pawn to c5. The opening strategy from white is definitely flexible and versatile, and you'll be able to achieve this position in a lot of your games. Sometimes play might deviate, so you might have to take a look into some sub-variations that I didn't cover in the video, but it's safe to say the vast majority of your games you should be able to achieve the position that we've been talking about. So if you've been looking for a chess opening, you're not too sure which one to go with, I definitely recommend the King's Indian attack to get you started. Like I said at the beginning, you don't have to be booked up to the gills, so definitely give it a shot. Also, if you've been playing the King's Indian attack or like playing against the King's Indian attack, definitely share your thoughts and feedback on that. It'll definitely contribute to the discussion for those who are interested in the opening. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.